When would you ever diagnose a patient as clinically insomniac? What are the criteria? What do we need to understand and know about insomnia?
People often call themselves insomniacs. It's like an identity that people often give to themselves. Sleep just doesn't play by the rules of modern productivity. What a lot of people do is that their working mind invades their bedroom space, and that is a recipe for insomnia. The way that the circadian rhythm comes into this is on a roughly 24-hour basis, 24.2 hours to be precise. Our body cells wake up and they go to sleep. Each cell within our body has a clock within it, and that clock indicates to our cells within our body whether it is time for activity or whether it's time for rest. If you did a really intense workout really late in the evening, it will dramatically affect your sleep.
Could you rectify some of the Dr. Google's myths, and could you bring a bit of clarity and reality and a bit of science into what does work and what doesn't?
Absolutely.
If work worries keep you up at night, quite literally, and you're suffering from bouts of insomnia or struggling to fall asleep or stay asleep, today's episode is just for you. As you may know from my personal story, I suffered from insomnia for many, many years, and in fact, it is one of the reasons why I decided to transition and become a clinical hypnotherapist. So I am particularly excited to announce that I have found one of the best UK's sleep doctor for you to learn from and get insights on the power of sleep, but also more specifically, what is insomnia, how does it happen, why does it happen, and what we can do about it. So let me go ahead and tell you a bit more about this week's amazing guest, Dr. Joshua Kovoor. He is considered the UK's leading GP sleep medicine specialist, and I can tell you that I really wish I had known him about 12 years ago. With his expertise in insomnia, sleep apnea, as well as sleep for performance, Dr. Kovoor believes that sleep may be the hidden key to the growing problem of fatigue and burnout that many of us face. Through practical strategies founded in high quality research and tailored to the busyness of professional lives, his mantra is that there is something for everyone when it comes to sleep. Dr. Kovoor, I'm so excited to have you on the show today, because the topic that we're about to talk about is one that has caused me, well, I don't know what else to say other than many sleepless nights. Sleep has been a bit of a torment in my past life. I like to think of, my previous life and my current life. So I've had a past life and a current life. My previous life was that of a insomniac lawyer, and my current life is of a founder and a well-being specialist and a clinical hypnotherapist who sleeps like a baby. So, there was life 1 and life 2.0, and I would choose this life any day, just because I know quite how painful it is not to sleep well, and the anxiety. There is something about the lack of sleep, doctor, that I would love to talk about, because for me, I developed an anxiety about sleep. It was such a dreadful experience that I started to become anxious about the idea of having to go to sleep, because I knew it usually didn't end well, and it was a struggle and it was a battle. So I developed a very toxic relationship with sleep. Is that something that you see in your practice, doctor?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thank you for sharing that, because what you described there is a variety of points that encompass a lot of people's experience when they have insomnia. But, getting to the heart of what you're saying, it was something to do with a relationship with its sleep itself, because we talk about sleep all the time in terms of, numbers and, the biology of it. But fundamentally, we all have our own relationship with sleep.
Yes.
From the moment we're born, even prior to being born, we are sleeping in our mother's wombs, and we have cycles of sleep and wake. And as we grow into children, we might have periods where we say, "I don't want to go to sleep," or times where sleep is a real comfort to us. And then there are times in our adult life where we have a different shift often, and it's that experience of sleep where we may say, I desperately need sleep, I'm struggling," or times where you say, sleep feels like my enemy and I'm fighting it, and why won't it come? And so I think there's this idea that not many of us talk about, which is that we all have a relationship with sleep. It's a very personal, unique relationship, and it's one that other people don't necessarily understand when they're not you. Um, and I think the people who are most aware of that relationship are the ones who are struggling with it. Because for the average sleeper who sleeps well or doesn't think about their sleep, they're not really thinking about, the fact that they sleep. It's an automatic behavior. Um, I often do see the ones who are talking about their sleep the most, the ones who are expressing emotion or anxiety or frustration. Those are the ones who often do have clinical insomnia or chronic insomnia. And I think they're often you can tell me as well whether this is your experience, but the ones who are often thinking about sleep and aware of it, and when they get into bed, you think, hang on, my sleep isn't here, I'm probably not going to get to sleep, or I'm waking in the middle of the night time, and what's my sleep going to do to my day ahead or tomorrow or the day after? And that does tend to be the experience for a lot of people.
Absolutely. So perhaps let's start with some sort of ground definition of foundation, because the term insomnia, I've noticed, can be used a bit loosely sometimes. So why don't we start with the sort of medical definition? So when would you ever diagnose a patient as clinically insomniac? What are the criteria? What do we need to understand and know about insomnia?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good place to start because people often call themselves insomniacs. It's like an identity that people often give to themselves. There is a medical definition for when something becomes medically significant insomnia. So, in this case, what we're talking about is chronic insomnia, really. So, let's start there. So, you've got two things really. To start off with, you've got acute insomnia and chronic insomnia. These two slightly different categories um, uh, represent two totally different ends of a spectrum. Now, acute insomnia is insomnia that is short lived, that should self resolve, and nearly every single person on earth will have a bout of acute insomnia at some point in their life. And there's around about 30 to 40% of adult individuals who, in any given year, will have a period of insomnia that they can recognize, but will usually be acute and short lived. Now, on the other side of the fence, there's those who have medically significant chronic insomnia, and there is a definition for that. So, those who have chronic insomnia will struggle with the difficulty getting to sleep, staying asleep, or waking up feeling unrefreshed or dissatisfied with their night of sleep, happening for at least 3 times per week for at least 3 months. And crucially, that impairment or that feeling of dissatisfaction with sleep has to have some implication on their daytime functioning. So if you have all of it, but the person feels great about their sleep and doesn't have any problem with it, technically that's not chronic insomnia. So, really baked into this definition of chronic insomnia is the idea that it has a very significant personal experiential effect on your life. And that's almost always the case. For those who say, look, I have insomnia, they don't talk about it as if they don't care. They talk about it in terms of like, this is affecting my life, it's affecting my relationships, it's affecting my ability to perform, and it's all embroiled and all kind of intertwined a little bit. Yeah, but so fundamentally, insomnia is that difficulty in initiating, maintaining sleep, and often it comes with early morning awakening as well.
Hmm. Sounds like you described my previous life. I battled with that for over 3 years in a row. So when you were talking about the rules of three, mine was topped up by the fact that that happened to me. So the chronic insomnia was for 3 consecutive
3 years.
years. And I can tell you that to say that I wasn't feeling well would be a wild understatement.
And I think what's amazing there is that like you thank you as well, by the way, because I think your story, and maybe we'll touch on it as we go through this, but your story will be really powerful as well, because I can say lots of things to my patients, but they often find that they it's such an isolating experience because no one, no one is necessarily in your bed whilst you're sleeping. And if you do have a bed partner, they're not necessarily aware of that torment of being awake in the nighttime and struggling to get to sleep. And many people do struggle with insomnia for years and years and years. In fact, that's probably classic of chronic insomnia, those people who are struggling not just for months, not just for 3 or 4 months, but it really does tend to be years before they seek any sort of help. And usually that help is only kind of comes, or you get to a point where you need to seek help, the point at which you feel burned out or you feel like you've tipped past the tipping point.
Yes. And could we talk about, in the context of insomnia, why is there a sort of almost a sort of connection between the likelihood of being affected by insomnia and being a high performer who is in a very, very high powered career and who tends to work very extended hours. So perhaps we're not talking about insomnia in the context of, well, I'm intentionally staying up until 5 a.m. because I'm doing all the work, but more of a, I'm desperate for sleep and it's 1 a.m. and I logged off and I signed off, but now I'm physically, geographically inside my bed, but I cannot sleep. And the reason this is really important to me to talk about that is because of my past life and my chronic insomnia misadventures. What happened to me is at first it started with I forced myself to stay up. So I trained to endure the pain of not sleeping, right? So I specifically remember, I have very vivid memory of battling the sensation of drowsiness and sleepiness and enduring that pain and skilling up and training myself on how to not feel sleepy and how to fight against it. And I remember there was a sort of a moment in time, like around the 4 a.m. mark, where I would shift from really exhausted to almost energetic, almost a kind of a euphoria. And that didn't last very long, but it lasted enough for me to complete the work that I had to do. And then there would be a crash. And one of the lowest points in my life when I was battling chronic insomnia was actually being woken up by a cleaner in my office, literally bumping into my head with the vacuum because I had collapsed behind my desk. So it's just to tell you just quite how bad it was, because I stretch it so much that I would wait to the point where, I would go from like awake, working, sort of collapsing, right? So very, very unhealthy. The reason I'm sharing my story is that then it got to a point where there were moments where I wasn't working. I wasn't trying to pull an all-nighter. I wasn't actively trying to stay up, but then I had lost the ability to switch off and to fall asleep because anxiety kicked in. So I really want to almost distinguish that. The sort of camp A where one is actively trying to keep themselves up because there's so much work to be done. But then B, this ripple effect, which is, well, now I've lost my capacity and ability to relax and seek calm and fall asleep.
Yeah. There are two parts to this answer. The first is that sleep just doesn't play by the rules of modern productivity. So we can be exceptionally high performing individuals who are very proactive, who are able to endure through stress and push to meet deadlines, push to meet to get projects completed. But sleep literally doesn't respond to effort. It's quite the opposite. So sleep will only come where effort is eliminated. So as soon as you start introducing effort into the equation, sleep becomes problematic. And that is one of the foundational concepts in insomnia, for example. But the first thing you actually mentioned was not specifically insomnia, because I'm sure that people listening to this, not everyone's got insomnia, but what a lot of people will have is pushing into the hours of sleep, and that's what I call sleep erosion. It's not a term you will see here and there, but I call it sleep erosion because what do we do in our modern productivity lifestyles? We have a lot of things to do, deadlines, commitments, professional, personal. We have X amount of waking hours, and so in order to get more done, we optimize our efficiency during those waking hours, but we try and extend our waking hours, and in doing so, we erode our sleep. Um, and we are able to erode our sleep because we have the ability to stay awake. We call it the voluntary control for wakefulness. We can't voluntarily sleep, but we do have some voluntary control to stay awake. So if you want to stay up till to celebrate the New Year's, then many people around the world do that, right? We have an
Right.
ability to do that. What you find is that insufficient sleep syndrome, which is what it's called, where you voluntarily reduce your sleeping hours, that in itself can be a bit of a stepping stone for people to then develop both a sense of burnout and fatigue, but also actually developing chronic insomnia. Now, not everyone who will reduce their waking hours, reduce their sleeping hours to accommodate all of the things they need to get done. Not everyone's going to then develop insomnia, but there is a proportion who will. And the reason often is when you're reducing your sleeping hours, number one, you've got loads on your mind. So you're carrying that everywhere you go, including into the bedroom. Number two, some people often work from their bedroom environments because they know they kind of need to be winding down. But what they do is dilute, or their working environment, their working mind invades their bedroom space. So I'll say that again. What a lot of people do is that their working mind invades their bedroom space, and that is a recipe for insomnia.
Hmm.
So one of the key principles to prevent something like chronic insomnia is to keep the bedroom solely for sleep. We do say for sleep, for sex, and getting dressed in sleep medicine, because people have lives and we have to be practical about things. But if you were to be a complete purist about this, purely a sleep fanatic, you would say, well, the bedroom is only a place to sleep, because anything else you do there acts as a sort of competitor. And you might say, well, there are plenty of people around the world going to bed, reading their books, and they get off to sleep just fine. But it's a bit like a Jenga tower. You take away 2 or 3 blocks in a person who's already prone to insomnia, and that might be like a type of personality in which people are desperate to try to sleep. And like we said, that's not very helpful. So that's 1 or 2 Jenga blocks removed. And then if you tip and pull out, suddenly you're starting to work in bed, then often that is enough to just tip the tower over and your brain is really activated. And that at that point, your brain has formed a kind of connection between being awake and being in bed. And often that connection then gets perpetuated, it gets continued, because you say, hang on a second, I can't get to sleep. I need to sleep. Why can't I get to sleep? And then the effort increases. The attention and the effort increases.
So as the effort to fall asleep increases, your sleep latency increases.
Mm. In other words, it's taking you longer and longer. You're trying to get to sleep, but it's taking you longer and longer to get to sleep. The time latency is simply the time in which you eventually fall asleep from the time you get into bed and say to yourself, "Okay, I'm going to get to sleep." That time until you actually fall asleep is called the sleep latency. And so what we'd love to have as our sleep latency is a sleep latency of somewhere between 10 to 20 minutes. That's
Is
deemed,
that it?
yeah,
That's normal, quote unquote
that's deemed
normal.
normal. Yeah. So for someone who has had insomnia, they think, oh my goodness, that is not me. I was not getting 10 to 20 minutes. For other people who have excessive sleepiness, and this is why I drew that distinction between those who have insufficient sleep, who may not have insomnia, who have eroded their hours, versus people with insomnia. Well, those with insomnia often have a long sleep latency. They struggle to get to sleep for ages and ages. Those with insufficient sleep, who have deliberately restricted their hours of sleep, often experience huge amounts of sleepiness, such that when they get into bed, eventually to say, I'm falling asleep, they often do fall asleep quickly
Oh,
within a
or
few minutes,
collapse behind a desk.
or collapse.
Yes, yes. No, and I love that you drew that distinction because, at least in my case, and I can only speak about my case, but I know it's happened to a lot of my clients as well. It's the self inflicted sleep erosion that actually led, or rather laid the foundation for my chronic insomnia, right? So there were days where I actively pursued an effortful and intentional sleepless night, but that led to, on days when I did want to sleep, I couldn't. Hence, the insomnia was almost a side effect or a net consequences of my active sleep erosion.
Yeah.
Is that common as a pattern?
Well, it's common in those who have a certain lifestyle and a certain so I would say it's common in those who have a certain lifestyle in which it requires them to be up and awake and doing lots, but it's also in a certain personality type in which you feel like you have to fix a problem. You know, this is a problem. I need to do it. I can do it. I'm a high performer. I'm able to deal with things. There must be a solution. I'm going to find it. And the problem is not saying there's a problem, I want to fix it, because that's great. If you have a problem, we should all be looking on for solutions. The problem is that effort is not the solution. And it's just a really weird thing to wrap your head around when you are so used to being able to take control of something, because fundamentally we cannot control sleep. We can nurture it like a plant. You've got a plant sitting in front of a window. If you leave it alone, it will die. But if you water it, give it sunlight, give it what it needs, it will thrive. So you are not giving that plant life. It lives, it does what it needs to, but you nurture it. You give it what it needs because you understand it. And so there's a subtle difference there between looking after something, knowing what it requires to thrive, and that's your sleep, versus trying to say, I give this plant life and I'm totally in control of it, because you're not. That it has its own behavior, it has its own life outside of you. If you go away for the weekend, your plant will probably survive and it will do its own thing.
Thank you for listening to this conversation today. I hope that you're learning as much as I am recording this with our amazing guest. I would like to ask you for a quick favor. If you are enjoying this show and you are one of our loyal listeners, or perhaps you're new to the show and this is the first time you listen to the episode, thank you and welcome. If I could ask you to make sure that you please follow the show or subscribe to the show using your favorite podcast player, it would be an amazing help to enhance the production and make sure that we can spread the message wide and encourage more high performers just like you to continue to thrive. So on that note, thank you for becoming a subscriber and a follower. And now let's go back to this amazing conversation.
So in the same way that our sleep is automatic, and I think that's what a lot of people don't understand, particularly in a world where there is a sleep hack for everything, and people are now incredibly interested in sleep, and so marketing in the world has gone towards a sort of drastically changed, focused on how can we optimize our sleep. But unless you start with the starting foundational principle of your sleep is automatic, you're going to get things wrong, because sleep is automatic.
What if it's not though, right? Like for somebody who's struggling, I would go as far as saying, like, I'm just putting myself back in the shoes of the person that I used to be. And if you told me that, doctor, I would get quite triggered. I'd be like, okay, well, thank you, doctor, but no, it's not automatic for me. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I sort of provocatively said that because that's absolutely what patients would say. If you tell someone who has insomnia, your sleep is automatic, you don't need to do anything, they'd get up at that moment, walk out the room and say, I'm not interested. So the subtle distinction is your biology can be automatic. It is automatic to a degree, but there are some things that we can do to influence it. So here are the automatic foundational principles that are the foundation of biological sleep. And here's where things don't feel automatic. So the automatic parts are two aspects: your circadian rhythm and something called your homeostatic sleep drive. Your circadian rhythm, have you heard of the circadian rhythm before?
Oh yes,
Yeah.
circadian rhythm. We became BFFs. And the reason
Oh,
I
that's
say
what I
that
like
is
to hear.
I had very dysregulated circadian rhythm because I was always exposed to blue light because of the work that I did. And I didn't have enough exposure to sunlight because I was mostly living out of my office. So I had extremely dysregulated circadian rhythm. And I now optimize actively my circadian rhythm. I use red light modulation therapy, etc., just for the purpose of my sleep. But please do let us know.
So your circadian rhythm is an automatic biological fact. So this is the part that I will say your circadian rhythm is automatic, no matter who you are, whether you have insomnia, whether you do not have insomnia, whether you have a different sleep condition, you still have a circadian rhythm. It comes from the Latin circa diem, meaning round about a day. Diem is a day. And that principle is based on the fact that within our bodies, on a cellular level, each cell within our body has a clock within it. And that clock indicates to our cells within our body whether it is time for activity or whether it is time for rest. Now, certain activities can happen during rest, but to put it simply, it's time for activity or it's time for rest. And one of those things that is obviously correlated with activity and rest is our sleep. We often, mix those two facts up. We often say wake and sleep is the same as activity and rest, but they're different because on a cellular level, our liver, our kidneys don't say they're not sleeping. They're just in forms of activity or they're in forms of rest. So the way that the circadian rhythm comes into this is on a roughly 24-hour basis, 24.2 hours to be precise. Our body cells wake up and they go to sleep. They wake up and they go to sleep, or they start becoming active and they start becoming rested and doing restful activities. This fact was demonstrated in the 1960s by a chap called Nathaniel Kleitman, and he did some experiments in the caves of Kentucky where he sat down in a cave and in complete isolation, in complete darkness, and you mentioned light, and we'll talk about that in just a second. He sat down in complete darkness and said, what's going to happen to my sleep and wake rhythms if I just stay in the dark? So what he found, interestingly, is that he woke and he slept on a roughly 24-hour basis absolutely automatically. Now, he didn't have chronic insomnia. He didn't have any other sleep disorder that was documented at the time, but he was just interested, would his body maintain its sleep and wake regulation in complete darkness? And the biology behind that is this circadian rhythm. What we know, though, is our circadian rhythm, like I say, which influences our sleep, our liver, our kidneys, our bowel habits, everything is influenced by a number of factors. One of those things, and the strongest thing, is light. So when we talk about light, we're talking typically about sunlight, natural full spectrum daylight. And what we want is we want that daylight in the morning, first thing in the morning, in our internal biological day. And we want to avoid bright light at night. Well, why is that? Well, the reason is that full spectrum light contains all of the colors of the rainbow, but it's particularly rich in 480 nanometer blue light. So this is when you were talking about blue light. Now, what we know about blue light, it is an incredible suppressor of the hormone melatonin. So there's a pathway where blue light from the sun reaches the eyes, hits the back of the eyes, and a specific cell, an ancient cell in the eye, is called the intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cell, long name. It travels down a tract called the retinohypothalamic tract, and then there is a complex set of neurons which end in a connection to a gland, a pea-sized gland in the brain called the pineal gland. And this pineal gland is what secretes melatonin. So long pathway, but essentially what that results is that during our biological night, when it's dark outside, melatonin is allowed to rise naturally. It is the hormone of darkness, and that also has some correlation with our sleep onset. If you have bright, high intensity blue light, what that does is delays our melatonin signaling to our body. And what that typically has is a bit of a chronobiotic effect. It means that it slightly delays our sleep phase. There has been a lot of hype around how much blue light might influence people's sleep. I think I want to talk about that in a second, but I want to come back to the second part of why I said that sleep was automatic. So first was your circadian rhythm. Second is something called the homeostatic sleep drive. That is the fact that when we are up and awake and moving and getting out and about and doing our day-to-day activities, we have something inside us like a balloon that fills and fills and fills, and we call it sleep pressure. So the moment you are up, waking and walking about, your balloon is just filling away in the background, such that by the end of the day, it should be nice and full and tight, such that when you are ready to sleep and it's full and tight, it collapses on itself and deflates quickly. And that is the first signal for our body to fall naturally into sleep. So there is this interplay between this naturally recurring circadian rhythm and this balloon that are like an orchestrated symphony that allow us to wake up. And towards the end of the day, the balloon is full, it collapses, sends us into sleep, and the circadian rhythm also follows and sends some of the circadian signaling to our body. It's very complex, but this two process model is very well established as an automatic fact. The problem can come where we have dysregulation to our circadian system. The problem can come where we are not allowing our balloon internally to fill up and to get full. So we are not adequately moving, exercising physically and mentally. And the other thing that we've already touched on is the voluntary sleep restriction that can come with busy lives. And that is what I termed sleep erosion. The fourth factor that ties into voluntary state of staying awake is anxiety. And I'm very happy to just touch on kind of why I talk about the voluntary state of staying awake and anxiety in the same bucket, even though they feel like totally two different things. Because when someone says to me, I'm anxious, I'm not then telling them, oh, well, you're trying to be. It's not, it's a voluntary state. It's not a voluntary state, but the two have some relationship with each other. But I want to throw it back to you just for a second to say, see if you've got any questions around that, because it's a lot to take in.
I love that you talked about that balloon, because one of the things that I did to naturally really sort of hack my insomnia, if I may say so, in addition to working with a hypnotherapist, was to actually really change my lifestyle around movement. So one thing that I used to do, or rather not do, is I had very poor movement routine. So I had a very sedentary lifestyle. I was working in an office and I didn't have a particularly disciplined workout routine. When I learn about the importance of movement to physically exhaust myself, so to speak, and not just be intellectually depleted or overstimulated, because I think that's also important to mention that when we are, working in the service industry, we're in our heads so much that although we are exhausted, we are also hyper stimulated. So that can also, in my experience, really influence our frustrations around sleep time because we're still in our heads. And for me specifically, workout in the morning and in sunlight, or if we live in England, as we sometimes have the misfortune of experiencing many days of grey, non-sunny mornings, having some kind of morning exposure to natural light was really, really something that helped me. And I also know for a fact that it changed my hormonal profile because my cortisol was also dysregulated when I burnt out and when I suffered from chronic insomnia. So perhaps at one point when it feels natural in the conversation, I would love to layer how circadian rhythm also is connected to cortisol dysregulation, because in addition to the blue light keeping us up if we are on our screen and TVs, etc., at night, high cortisol will also block that melatonin from kicking in. So I would love to tie that into the conversation if we could.
Yeah, sure. Should we do that now? Because I think it's really topical. I think what we've got here is this idea that your circadian rhythm is naturally swinging into periods of wakefulness and sleepiness and activity and rest. But we know that doesn't always pan out that way. And what you've described is very classic. So periods in which hormones like cortisol may be raised inappropriately. Now, cortisol is often termed a stress hormone. Stress does not necessarily mean a bad thing when it is at the right times. So we need a level of stressors to enable our bodies to start waking up in the morning. So it is like a signal to ourselves, you need to get going. Come on, let's get going. So when you had mentioned previously in our conversation, you know what? There was a period when I had chronic insomnia that, I'd be late into the night, I'd be really exhausted at some point, and then 4 a.m. I'd have this peak in my alertness or slight spike in something going on around that time. Well, that's actually correlated with your natural circadian spike in your cortisol levels. So
Hmm.
there is an element to which you will still have had this background circadian rhythm going on in a dysregulated but somewhat still regulated way, in which the cortisol still knows that it kind of needs to kick in around that time. And your body, a lot of the cells in your body still feel like they have to start waking up, but it's getting confused signaling because you've been up all night and you haven't had that experience of rest. The other times we often see inappropriate cortisol spikes, and when I say inappropriate, what I'm talking about is cortisol shouldn't really be spiking into the late evening and the middle of the night, because these are times in which it should be low. Cortisol being high can have links with suppressing melatonin and suppressing sleep. And so what we find that if the cortisol levels are inappropriately high, it can be a sleep disruptor as a stress response. But we see that often in those who are experiencing anxiety. And so in those who have generalized anxiety, or in those who are having a persistent baseline of chronic stress, we often see that cortisol is persistently and chronically spiked. And we see that what that has downstream effects on is levels of inflammation, so that there are biological markers that are picked up in the blood, interleukin 6, C-reactive peptide, which we call CRP. These are biological markers that we see are slightly raised in individuals who have chronic levels of anxiety, chronic levels of stress, or chronic heightened cortisol secretion. And of course, chronic levels of increased inflammatory markers are also associated with chronic pain, which can disrupt sleep further.
Do you like to check your patient's cortisol levels?
So that's a really interesting thing. Now, cortisol level standardization is really for specific medical conditions in which there's deemed a in which there is deemed a medical problem. So there are some conditions to do with your adrenal glands. One is called Conn syndrome, one is called Addison's disease. And Addison's disease is often the condition in which you have a reduction in the amount of natural secretion of certain hormones in from the adrenals. And so what we find in this condition is that the cortisol may not be appropriately secreted into the system. Now, routine testing of cortisol is not necessarily helpful, because what is more helpful is looking at the trajectory. So if you take a single measurement of cortisol, even if it is a 9 a.m. standardized cortisol level, it will not necessarily give you the right information of where in that peak it is happening. So even if it's within a normal range, it may the trajectory of the change is really what you're interested in. And we do not yet have a longitudinal way of measuring cortisol over a few hours throughout the day. There are interesting devices coming onto the market where people are looking to do that through non-invasive ways, rather than having blood tests every few minutes or every half an hour or so, because that's not practical for individuals. So I think it's one of these things where we say, watch this space, because the field of circadian technologies is developing as we speak.
Yes, I've had clients experimenting with saliva cortisol testing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they've been doing it up to twice a day to see their
Yeah.
markers.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's that comparison between the AM cortisol and later on in the day that is really helpful, rather than a static reading.
Mm.
The static reading is often helpful if we suspect there is a chronic or persistent biological medical deficiency of hormones like cortisol.
Now, can we go back to that balloon? Because I love that concept, and actually, that's the first time it is described to me like that. So that's new to me, and I love that. So, can you tell us more about what can dysregulate the balloon and what can optimize the balloon, and how would one know that their balloon is a bit wonky?
Yeah, I mean, it's relatively straightforward. So the balloon is a metaphorical representation of a hormone or a neurotransmitter within the brain called adenosine. Now, adenosine is a byproduct of cellular metabolism that happens in the body. So everything you do in your body, usually physical effort, results in the production of adenosine. Everything you do is fueled by a chemical called adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. When this biological currency that you have is secreted in your system and fuels your cells to do lots of activity, what it does is that your cells use it for energy, then secrete the adenosine, which then accumulates. And when it accumulates in your brain, that is what's almost filling up this balloon. So, simply put, any type of energy demanding activity will cause an increase in the balloon size. Um, we typically say, if you're going to do it, start early. Start early on in the day, start doing physically demanding activities, but keep them consistent throughout the day. If you partially fill the balloon early with a workout in the morning, but then go and lie in bed the rest of the day, that's not going to help. So there is this element to which is a bit of persistent activity throughout the day that is really needed to start filling up this balloon properly.
And is that also the reason why, if you do very strenuous workout in the evening, you will struggle to fall asleep for some of us? But also, if you have very intense cognitive load, such as writing a very complex piece of memo, for example, or being caught on a very, very frustrating or rather nerve-wracking email chain at 1 a.m. is not going to be conducive to you having a sweet, sweet night
Yeah.
a few hours later. Is it both physical and cognitive, the load?
So both of those things are actually influencing the other two parts of what drives sleep. So the first part is talking about, if you do a super intense workout too late in the evening, is that, might that keep you up? And the evidence is mixed around this. There was some suggestion that said that if you did a really intense workout really late in the evening, it will dramatically affect your sleep. The evidence these days finds that for the majority of people, doing a moderate intensity workout, as long as it's not within a half an hour to an hour before bed, before sleep itself, is unlikely to dramatically influence your sleep. Even a high intensity interval period of exercise, high intensity high intensity interval training exercise in at least an hour away from your sleep is unlikely to affect your sleep dramatically. When it does affect your sleep, what we see is that it's affecting those cardiometabolic risk factors for poor sleep. So what we're saying there is that during the evening time, your circadian rhythm is the one that should allow your heart rate to start slowing down, your blood pressure to start dropping a little bit, your respiratory rate to start slowing down a little bit, your body temperature to start cooling down naturally a little bit. And these are signals to your body that it's time to sleep. What you're doing when you exercise intensely around the time of sleep is actually you're stopping that circadian down regulation into sleep, and you're actually, that's a circadian disruption rather than a balloon disruption, a sleep drive disruption. um, does that make
Thank you.
sense?
Oh, yes. I really love the clarity that you brought to that point. So thank you for that.
The second thing that you mentioned, which I also want to touch on very briefly, is that if you have a huge cognitive load in the evening, if you're doing lots of work, if you're really in the zone and you have a huge demanding task, how does that influence sleep? How does that cause the disruption to sleep, and does that affect your sleep pressure? Well, no, that is actually, in theory, that should be building your sleep drive and helping fill that balloon even more. The problem here is that that influences the voluntary part of sleep. That is saying that, hang on, I've got loads to do. I'm just going to push my bedtime a little bit longer because I've just got this high demanding, mentally, cognitively exhausting task that needs my attention. And the attention, I think, is there what disrupts the sleep slightly.
I'm so glad you mentioned that. I wonder, what is your take as a very experienced sleep doctor on holistic techniques such as journaling, brain dumping, getting back up. So we hear so many things, right? And sometimes a lot of contradictory information. So specifically, I want to put myself back in the shoes of when I was giving it, I call it Dr. Google, before I worked with a doctor like you, for instance. I gave things a good Google, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners use Dr. Google as well. And when you do that, you get so much contradiction, right? So Dr. Google will tell you, yes, do not stay in bed if you don't feel sleepy. Just get up, brew yourself some kind of herbal tea, come back. Some will say journal, brain dump. Others will say if you put down the things that stress you out, your brain is going to focus on those things and sleep is going to become even harder. So there is a lot of noise out there on the do's and don'ts. Could you rectify some of the Dr. Google's myth, and could you bring a bit of clarity and reality and a bit of science into what does work and what doesn't work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for bringing this up, because there is a lot of confusion around what should be done and what shouldn't be done leading up to bedtime, the types of activities. And the evidence that says that there are a variety of techniques that might work. So, mindfulness techniques for sleep can be incredibly powerful. So, mindfulness, have you ever heard of that?
That's what I do. That's my everyday life.
Your work within hypnotherapy very much falls into the mindfulness camp, doesn't it? Into the category of doing lots of mindfulness based work.
Absolutely, absolutely. And can I share just a little thing about mindfulness? And please share your opinion. And if we have a difference of opinion there, I would also really welcome a bit of a intellectual debate on that, and I would love your take. I don't love that term, and the reason I say that is being someone who suffered from chronic insomnia. The last thing I wanted, doctor, is my mind to be full. I wanted my mind to be empty, and
Yeah.
so the word mindful is one that I choose not to use that
Mm.
much, and I will use words such as, obviously, hypnotherapy is a quote unquote mindfulness technique, and it goes under this umbrella: meditation, breathwork, visualization. But the word mindful, for someone with my past medical history, is almost like that specific thing that I'm trying to avoid. So for me, it would be empty mind, or mind empty, or the art
Yeah.
of clearing it out, right? But the last thing I want at 1 a.m. on my pillow is a full mind.
Yeah, yeah, I can definitely appreciate that. And actually, that's probably one of those times where that term is just not helpful, because actually you're saying this is getting in the way of the core therapy or technique here. The idea that my mind needs to be full, and you're right, that is completely opposed to what the types of techniques that you'd be employing. So I think I would actually agree with you. If that's an unhelpful term for you, bin it. Go, and actually, what I think of when I think of mindfulness, and if I use that term, it is not so much that the mind is full, but the mind is, instead of having a hurricane of chaos where you can't appreciate any distinct thought or any one thing as an individual emotion or thought, it is just a an awareness and a kind of recognition that there are things entering your mind, and one of the key components of these techniques um, is around being able to appreciate something as separate to you. If a thought enters your mind or an emotion, you're experiencing it, you can recognize it, you're in a particular moment, and you experience it, and it goes. And so in my mind, these techniques are far more about I mean, they're deemed in the world of psychology, third wave therapies, this is the idea of novel therapies that go beyond classic cognitive behavioral therapies. Um, but the principle here is around things that are meditative, things that are calming, and that is all built from an appreciation that in our world, and for those who have insomnia as well as those who perhaps have sleep erosion, where they're continuing their work late into the night, what we need to build in is a buffer time. Now, a buffer time is this space and certain activities that allow your body to wind down, both on a mental load and on a physical on a physical level. So the way I like to structure things is by starting with the world around you, things that you're in control of, saying, I can organize this space, and then working your way in to your physical sense of self. So there are techniques including relaxation techniques, uh, and then moving your way into the cognitive therapies and cognitive techniques, including meditation-based techniques as well. So in all overall, what we're talking about is a buffer time in which there are certain activities and environments in which you're altering your environment and your internal state of being to start winding down. So some of those, go on. You're going to say something.
Well, the first thing that springs to mind here is what I hear a lot of my clients say when they come to me, and it's often the fact that what they use as a quote unquote sedative, right? Something to put them down when they've had a very sort of high octane day, right? With making decisions and dealing with a lot of money and a lot of responsibility and a lot of team members, is often to self medicate by using quite a lot of alcohol and binging on, say, Netflix or Apple TV, or it doesn't matter what binge watching of choice, and then scrolling, right? So those are the three things that I hear most often in terms of sort of self-soothing mechanism, as well as raiding the freezer for the Ben and Jerry's and any other like nighttime snacking. So,
Yeah,
and of course, if you
absolutely.
can
We've all
combine
been
it
guilty.
all, right, like a good old Netflix binge session with a glass of wine and throw in a couple of sweets, and you've got this sort of perfect trilogy of
Yeah, absolutely.
how common is that amongst your patient, and what would you say to those coping mechanisms that really we know are not conducive of quote unquote a good night's sleep, but oftentimes do feel like a crutch and something we sort of rely on to sedate us. I have a lot of clients tell me that red wine or whiskey or rum actually has a bit of a sedative effect, and
Yeah.
it makes them feel a bit calmer and therefore a bit drowsier. And on a night where they feel really agitated and very restless, boozing up a bit more than the average night really helps them to access sleep. What would you say to that, and how common is it?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's really common, and the principle there is really understandable. People are trying to say, "I need something to bring me down. I've been up here. I need to come down here to get into my sleep." And the principle is great. The problem is those things that we've mentioned, so alcohol, binging Netflix or whatever TV subscription service it would be, and having late night snacks, all of those things may feel like they're relaxing in the moment, but ultimately on a biological level can disrupt the sleep itself. So we haven't talked a huge amount about sleep architecture, but that is the idea that we all go through sleep stages every night. So in cycles of about 90 minutes, we go through stages called stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 sleep, and into a lighter stage of sleep called REM sleep. So many of us have heard about REM sleep. Maybe we've heard about deep sleep as well. But these are the four stages of sleep. And then, of course, we've got wakefulness as well. So when we talk about sleep architecture, what we realize is each one of those stages of sleep has important biological functions. For example, in deep stage 3 sleep, we have a release of certain growth hormone responsible, pathways. So we have the release of growth hormone, which then signals cellular restoration. It signals skeletal muscle regeneration. So that helps from a physical and immune function point of view. And then in lighter stages of sleep, it also is very responsible for some very core energy conservation principles of us sleeping. And in REM sleep, what we have is a huge activity in our brain, which is all to do with the processing of memories and emotions and doing a lot of the emotional therapy that you would usually pay thousands of pounds to have, but happens each night in REM sleep. The reason I talk about REM sleep is that alcohol is a sedative initially. It acts on GABAergic receptors in the brain. GABA is a chemical that is associated with the onset of sleep and sleep pathways in the brain. So that is tied to sleep onset. However, alcohol itself fragments sleep. And so what it does is it does not allow you to access REM sleep adequately. And it breaks up your REM sleep and it destroys your REM sleep, such that even if you are not aware that it's done that, when we look at the brains of people who have drunk alcohol, we see that their REM sleep is dramatically fragmented in the night.
And that's why you wake up with a hangover, or that's a different mechanism from a
Well, there
biological
are many
standpoint.
mechanisms behind the hangover. That's a slightly different mechanism, but actually, it's the principle is still there. That actually, having not gained adequate quality of sleep, what you are left with is a grogginess, often headaches, where that adenosine has not been adequately cleared from the system. That balloon has not deflated down to a completely empty balloon ready to start filling the next day. And so it's got this residual adenosine hanging about, but it's also the fact that REM sleep has not adequately been achieved.
Now, being mindful of the fact that I'm French and I have a home in the wine region, I feel like the question I'm about to ask is rather dangerous and potentially loaded, but I'm
Sure,
going to
sure.
ask it
No,
anyway.
no. Yeah.
Is there any safe dosage or self amount of alcohol at night that one can have without compromising their sleep?
I think the first thing for me to say is that your sleep is there to serve you. It's not. One of the first things that often becomes a trap for people who are interested in sleep is that their life becomes so dominated with the idea of sleeping well that they forget that it's there to serve them and their life. So my bottom stance, my foundational stance is that you should live your life. You should enjoy your life. It is okay to have a drink, have some wine, have a beer in the evening. As long as you can appreciate on a biological level it's having some effect on your sleep, then that's okay. It's not that you cannot do these things. However, in answer to your question, there is no known specific amount of alcohol concentration that will not disrupt your REM sleep, that will not disrupt your sleep architecture. It happens on a dose dependent level such that you have a huge amount of alcohol, it's going to disrupt it much more, as well as probably giving you gastritis and heartburn and probably having a whole load of other effects. But from a sleep architecture point of view, that has not been quantified adequately to the point we say that this amount will not affect your sleep. And it's very user dependent as well.
Yes, well, I suspected you would say as much. And I also self experimented. And the reason I say that is because not every night, because I think it's important not to get into a sort of gadget addiction, which at some point I think I was a bit victim of, or rather, not victim, but just sort of engaged too much with my sleep gadgets that I became a little bit too dependent. I developed a bit of an over reliance. So I've now learned how to cycle in and out of wearing my sleep gadgets. I
Yeah.
think that there is some benefits and I would love your take on it. But I also think that, particularly for a type A with slightly obsessive tendencies, it can become quite strenuous and quite obsessive as a sort of, you wake up and then you check your aura ratings and then you almost go into a bit of a bad mindset if you haven't had optimal sleep. And I started to notice that and I didn't like it. So the reason I'm bringing that up is because I experimented with that one glass of wine, let's say 90 minutes before sleep, and even then, I could see an impact on my REM sleep compared to a night where I had zero glass of wine. So even just one glass had an impact, but it wasn't catastrophic, not at all. But I noticed, at least for my rating, if you're going into 2 glasses plus, like you have that 2 glass session over dinner. So we're not talking a complete boozed out evening, but 2 glasses plus, then I could really see an impact on my REM sleep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's brilliant as well. And I think this is the value of wearable sleep technology, wearable health technologies is that we're getting insights into our health, into our sleep. The technologies are getting there. They're getting better and better. They do not perfectly stage sleep, even the ones that say we can tell you your REM sleep and non-REM sleep. The accuracy, and particularly the accuracy of staging REM sleep, can be a little bit off at times, and it can confuse it for stage one sleep, unfortunately, which is a totally different stage of sleep. And even deep sleep can be overrepresented, and it can tell you you're getting more deep sleep. So the data we're getting is not perfect, but for purposes like that, where you're interested and you're saying, I kind of want to know, what is the alcohol doing to my system? How much is it disrupting? Is it fragmenting my sleep? And the times where maybe you get an indication of your REM sleep, how much is it doing that? I think for a certain individual who will not run with that and become really obsessive about it or become really panicked about it, it can be really useful information. And I think the medical field as well, and those in my field of sleep medicine, are acknowledging that actually this is really helpful information for some individuals, but how do we help balance that information against it being potentially harmful and unhelpful?
Absolutely. And I wonder if we could touch on now that we've covered the alcohol, I wonder if we could touch on the binging on TV series and watching a movie, because I'm sure this comes up a lot with your patient, certainly with my clients. It is, I would say, perhaps the number one sort of evening activity for my clients to say, well, that's how they switch their busy minds off, right? Like, that show is going to take my mind away from the email interaction I just had with my boss. And very often time, that one episode turns into three, and you intended to go to bed at, say, 1 a.m. and it's now 2:30, right? And I believe that's really the danger of what I call binge watching, is that you get on that cliffhanger and then you get sort of a little bit hooked and then you just watch the next one. So tell us more about that and what can we do instead?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So again, like I mentioned, the principle there of trying to do something de-stressing is pretty good. And the idea of watching a TV show is not terrible either, because the state in which you want to be prior to sleep, the activities that are going to be most helpful are those that are enjoyable, that are calming, but not overexciting. Nothing that's going to stimulate your mind too much. But when it comes to being a distraction from work, watching TV can be helpful. I think the danger comes with modern TV shows that are literally designed for you to binge watch, that when they're designed for you to say one episode after the other, where you've left with just not enough information that you need to watch the next episode. I think that's where that's not necessarily in our control how those TV shows are designed, but what we have to be, it's what we have to be aware of. Um, the good thing about episodes in general is that they are confined to 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour. An hour is quite a long time when we're talking about preparing for sleep, because if we're going from 9 p.m. to 10 p.m., for example, and then we say, okay, I'll watch another one, 10 p.m. to 11, and then you say, you know what, I'll just watch one more. Then you've hit midnight, and you've potentially eroded an hour extra compared to when you could have gone to bed an hour earlier. Everyone is a bit different. There is no set bedtime for any one person, but let's say you are a person who, for you, 8 hours sleep is roughly right, and your bedtime should be about 10 p.m., biologically speaking. Then by pushing yourself an hour back, you've cut out potentially some of those early valuable stages of deep sleep that you get early on in your night of sleep. And so I think when talking about watching TV shows, well, opt for something that is 30 minutes or less in terms of episode length. Opt for something that perhaps was made in the 90s or early 2000s, if you can still get on board with watching like an old show, like watch Friends or something like that, then why not? Because they are usually resolved by the end of the episode. There's usually some level of resolution with these shows. There is not a huge evidence base around this, as far as I'm aware. But in terms of the psychology behind it and the stimulation and the way that shows are designed, it would be much preferable to have something that is confined so that you can reevaluate at the end of the episode. How am I doing? Is it about time for sleep? In fact, yesterday, that's exactly what happened with my wife and I. We watched something. It was pretty trashy. I won't say what it was. And we we watched this TV show. Had a pretty long episode length, and it was about an hour in length. And at the end of it, my wife said to me, "Shall we watch another one?" And I am not perfect by any means when it comes to this sort of thing. But I said to her, "Do you know what? I'm really tired. I'm really sleepy. I think we should go to bed." And that's what we did, and it was fine. And we made that decision together. But I think it takes more effort when you have a long episode to, if you've started the second episode, to say, no, I have to get to bed now, because you're in the middle of an episode by that point. You're going to finish it, and it will probably, push back your bedtime by another half an hour or an hour.
Can I give you an anecdotal psychological insights into what I find really works beautifully for relaxation without the stimulation? And I love to share that because I've sort of experimented with that technique. I think calling it a technique is embellished. It's more of a sort of little experiment. But what's
You should
fun,
patent it. Whatever is coming next, you need to.
I don't think it's good enough for that. I don't think it's groundbreaking, but it's interesting. And the reason I'm sharing it, and I wouldn't be sharing it if it was just a unique personal experience, is that sort of suggested it to some of my clients who thought it was a rather sweet idea, and they decided to adopt it, and the results worked. So I'm just going to share it. I refrain completely from series just because I don't trust myself because of my past bad habits. So a series, a very, very special treat for me. And that's something that I will do very intentionally and only on an evening where I'm not performing the following day, right? So that really is sort of my criteria, because I know that that could be potentially a danger zone for me. So the one thing that I wanted to share is when I do want to calm and relax, and I think that using TV might be a route to do that before, say, a meditation session or a hypnosis session, I will time bound the dosage of movie time I will allow myself, and I will watch something I've seen many, many, many times. So there is no FOMO and there is no cliffhanging whatsoever. And I would even fraction that movie, and I will give myself the joy of watching that movie over, say, a series of 4 consecutive days in 20 minutes increment. So I will go and watch, an old classic like, A Pretty Woman and Dirty Dancing and split it into 25 minutes increment and allow myself to watch that like a mini episode with no FOMO at the end, because I know how it ends. I've seen it so many times. And then once I've done that, I will go and practice my little meditation or my self hypnosis and enter into the sleep stage then. So I'll get my little entertainment, which is really time bound. And then I get my deep relaxation for my brain, which enables me to access sleep.
Yeah, I mean, that predictability is brilliant because your body knows what's coming next. It's not trying to think, oh my goodness, what's coming next in this episode. And if you're a sort of person who can time block effectively and you're used to that in your day-to-day life, and you say, I'm pretty used to time blocking, I'll give myself half an hour here, and then we'll just pick it back up tomorrow night, then that's brilliant. There are so many wind down activities. I know your initial question was all about, wind down activities. I mean, they can range from having a cup of herbal non-caffeinated tea with your partner in the evening. It can be sitting at home reading a book. Ideally, if you're doing any of these activities, they are not in the bedroom, as we mentioned earlier. Just because you're preparing yourself for sleep, but you're not quite asleep yet, so you don't want to be doing them in the bedroom. Another thing that is widely reported in the literature as a physical technique is having a warm bath. And the idea is, if you are spent in a hot or warm bath for at least 15 minutes, ideally hitting 20 or 30 minutes, which is pretty long when you think about, that. But some people, very happy to sit in a bath for that amount of time. When you are in a bath for that amount of time, your blood vessels in your peripheries around your hands and your feet, they vasodilate, they open up. And what that does is allows your body to cool effectively. As soon as you get out of the bath, that vasculature, those blood vessels in your hands and your feet, allows heat to dissipate into the environment rapidly because you're in a cooler environment compared to your internal body temperature. And what that does is signals again part of your circadian system to your body. Okay, it's time for sleep. We're all doing all of the right things. This system is automatic. You're doing the right things. Well done. Let's cool down. And then again, it's a signal for sleep. When you have your herbal tea, more often than not, it's not the herbal tea itself or anything on a very, very obvious, strong biological factor from the properties in the tea. The evidence is a bit mixed around that. But more often than not, what we see is that it's that automatic pattern or that routine of saying, this is an activity that I associate with winding down on a subconscious level. My body is starting to relax. This feels good to me. I'm feeling relaxed. And it's this cohesion between a symphony of different things. So maybe you're sitting there watching your relaxing show in the evening, having your herbal tea, you've just had your hot bath, you get into your pajamas. That's another automatic behavior that we associate with sleep. And then you're in bed. So all of these things are subtle signals to your body to start winding down. And the more you do them and the more that your body starts associating them with sleep, the stronger that signaling becomes as a buffer zone.
And I love that you mentioned that routine. And for me, the sort of repetitive nature of that routine, almost having it as a sort of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I know that may feel a little bit rigid and a little bit disciplined, but when it comes to sleep hygiene, I find that structure really takes the strain away. So almost, and I'm going to borrow your language here in a very positive way, almost making it automatic. So I know now that I go and I make myself my little lavender tea, and I know that really helps me because I love the scent and it brings me back to my childhood. And then I will have the bath that you mentioned, and I will usually follow that by putting warm socks on so that I can keep a little bit of that heat on my feet, which I find very comforting. And then when it comes to the time where I'm approaching bed and I want to fall asleep, for me, really game-changing hack has been nighttime meditation story. And I think perhaps the word meditation here as well is not particularly helpful, but just guided storytelling meditation, some kind of a story, which I've heard before. So I like to actually listen to the same one. I rotate between a few. And that's also why for my clients, I design different landscape or soundscape where there is, sort of walk in the British meadows. There is a sort of invitation to the Maldives.
Yeah,
There
this is
is different sort of setting, right? I have a winter chalet one. And it's funny because a lot of my clients say, oh, I've listened to that one maybe 10, 15 times and I keep going back to that one and I build my little favorite. And I would like to say, like, it doesn't matter that you've listened to it so many times. It's actually a good thing because
yeah.
your brain is not trying to find the resolution, right? So your brain knows how it ends and it should be rather boring, right? Like those stories are not meant to be exciting in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Boring is beautiful in this situation. Boring is great because we're not craving stimulation. It's one of these rare times in our day where our body gets a chance to not be stimulated, to not be overexcited. And the more we can allow it to do that, the better.
Oh, I love this conversation. I have a whole list of topics that we didn't even begin to cover.
Oh, I feel so guilty.
So I feel like we should do a part two at
Yeah,
some
yeah,
point
more
in
than happy to
London.
do that. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Maybe even in person. I will invite you to our studio and we will do that as a part two because I wanted to talk about sleep apnea and snoring and CPAP machines. And
Yeah.
honestly, I think this at this point, this is a podcast too, if you agree.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's loads to talk about in the future. Sleep apnea, all sorts of other things that can be covered. I
So
would
we
love
do
to
a
talk
bit of
about that too. That would be great.
okay, we do a bit of a teaser now. After having talked about not having cliffhangers, we're
Yeah,
creating
I know.
cliffhangers for our listeners.
Well, it's great. If anyone finds this so enthralling that it's keeping them up at night, I'll take that as a good signal that we've talked about some interesting stuff.
Well, I'll tag my meditation recording along to this show, so to make sure that if they listen to this in the evening, they get to fall asleep by listening to the recording. So
Fantastic.
thank you so much. My last question for you, Doctor, is if our listeners want to work with you to optimize their sleep, and if they want to connect with you and connect to your world, what would be the best way for them to get in touch?
Great. Yeah. If you want to get in touch, I am pretty active on LinkedIn, so I'm sure you can link my LinkedIn. I'm just Dr. Joshua Kovoor. I also my website is joshuakovoor.com, and you can reach out to me there. You can book a sort of one-to-one where we can just have a brief chat, see how I can help you. But yeah, I very much work one-on-one with people to see how I can help meet their needs, because everyone's a bit different.
Thank you so much. What a lovely way to spend the afternoon. And I will fall asleep thinking about this conversation tonight.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Okay.
Throughout this podcast, you just heard about the benefit of having some form of mind relaxing activity in the evening so that you can fall asleep in a very relaxed state. One of my favorite ways to achieve that is to listen to guided meditation recording. And please don't attach too much importance to the word meditation. I know that sometimes it can be off-putting because you think it's going to have to be effortful and you're going to have to learn a technique or a skill. My type of guided meditation is actually the kind where I become your sleep guide and I tell you a story, a very relaxing story where your mind can gently drift off and there is nothing for you to do other than listen to the sound of my voice and be guided into a full and restful night of deep sleep. So if you would like to go ahead and experience that for yourself tonight, please go to the podcast by theme tab on my website and you can go to the M for meditation, where you will see a whole library of different meditation recording with different soundscape and different places, anywhere from the beach to a winter wonderland, so you can choose which setting and which landscape you want to fall asleep to. I hope you will find it as relaxing as possible and that you will enjoy a good night of deep sleep. Thank you for spending your time with me today and listening to this episode. Remember to subscribe so that you can receive weekly updates. And if today's message resonated with you, please remember to share it with a friend, a colleague, or a loved one who could really benefit from this episode.